Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. This episode sees the return of the very first guest I ever had on the show, Professor Yuval Feldman. It felt appropriate to have him on the launch episode in 2019 because Yuval was one of the people that helped me to see the links between something that fascinated me, behavioural science, and the job that I was doing as a compliance and risk officer. His book, The Law of Good People, was and remains an absolute inspiration to me. And if you've ever heard me speak or engaged me as a client, there'll be at least one thing I've shared with you that's in some way been inspired by Yuval. So as we approach the, I can't quite believe I'm saying this, 200th episode of the show, I wanted to bring him back to talk. In part to say thank you for all the things that he's inspired, but also because COVID has given Yuval some amazing opportunities to further his research. Not only has he been helping the Israeli government to manage its response to the pandemic, but he's also been able to find ways to use life under COVID as a large-scale field experiment. So whether you work in ethics or compliance, or are just fascinated by the dynamics of how people try to influence us to comply with rules, which, let's face it, is something we're all now all too familiar with, then what you're about to hear are some fascinating insights delivered as ever with intellectual humility, a good dose of humour, and in a way that makes complex things easily understandable. Before we begin, an apology. When we recorded this, I had COVID, which explains my croaky voice, and we also had some technical issues in recording Yuval's end of the show. But I hope that a slightly lower than usual audio quality is more than compensated for by a very high quality of content. Yuval, that is, not me, I'm just as bad as I normally am. But Yuval is fabulous, so please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Professor Yuval Feldman on trust and compliance. Yuval, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan.
I'm really excited because you were the very first guest on the show and helped me kickstart it. So it's only right that we get you back. And of course, when we first spoke, that was at a time when we hadn't really heard of COVID. And so since then, we've had this small adventure that we've all been on. And I imagine that's been influencing your work quite a lot. Can you talk about what you've been doing since we last spoke?
In terms of relationship with compliance, no one is happy, of course, with COVID. But for people who do the kind of research I'm doing, COVID was like getting this huge field experiment about what can governments do to cause people to change their behavior. And it was really the perfect storm in a sense that you always, in any other context, you have behaviors going on for years, and it's very hard to isolate the effect of what the government expects you to do and whether you change your behavior. Do you do it because of, existing norms, existing community norms, past behavior? Here, it was something new. All of a sudden, governments around the world had to deal with a very life-changing circumstances where you had to adopt behaviors you never used before, which allow for a much better understanding from a compliance research perspective of what governments do and how it affects the public behavior. And of course, there is a huge variation in the kind of behavior we expected the government to engage in, things they had to do, things they had to abstain from doing. And I have been working in various advisory teams that the Israeli government established, I think, as many other governments, where people from various backgrounds, obviously the leading people are epidemiologists and doctors, but also there was some recognition that the behavioral perspective is important. And it's really affected dramatically the way I see compliance now, and affected the kind of things I work on academically.
Wow. And as you say, it's a terrible situation, but it's this perfect case study in terms of everybody has to do it. It's enforced on people. So really, really, really interesting stuff. And so the government, I'm fascinated by this idea that the government pulls out not only medical professionals, but also people in other fields. And I think that's a really interesting sort of vote in favor of behavioral science in your area of research, because it really says, look, actually, when we're trying to change human behavior, yeah, we need to deal with the virus, but we also need to deal with the behavior that propagates the virus.
Right. Definitely. And I think, again, I think the jury is still out whether behavioral science was up for the job. I mean, I think there were many situations where I thought the behavioral perspective was helpful. And I think it at least enabled us to realize is that how hard it is to predict without actually collecting data. And this is on a few fronts. I mean, obviously the whole kind of behavioral informed compliance and cooperation research tries to at least pride itself for being kind of data driven. And so you do experiments, you do research, you do surveys, and then, for example, I remember there was some dilemma which exists in many countries whether to ask people to wear masks all the time or only in like rooms within like closed not in the open air. And it's basically a dilemma, right? What will be better? When will people are more likely to be with mask indoors? Is it when they wear it all the time or when they only need to wear it when they enter the room? So, one is kind of more general, kind of broad perspective, and one is more judging or kind of trusting your ability to be responsible and have the mask in your pocket or something, and then, take it out and then put it only when it's really needed. And I try to bring to look for some research, and I talked to some policymaker about the research that I found. If I'm not mistaken, it was from Denmark. And he said, "Will you bring me a research from Denmark? What we're going to do it about Israeli population?" And I thought to myself, this is so interesting. So basically, and I didn't really have a good answer. Basically, we are in a situation where we keep collecting data. We have, more than 200 countries around the world, and probably many of those countries are like we've seen in the US, that it's one country, but, behavior was so different across different parts of the US and probably in other countries as well. And then you have this research and you can't really use it. So, okay, something worked in one country, in one context, and then it's also an open question, what context? But let's focus first on the country. Basically, no research paradigm that allows you to translate findings from one country to what will help compliance in another country. We kind of assume it's the same, and I think many researchers have it, but this kind of policymaker thinking about, and again, I think many politicians have these very pessimistic views about their own public. Sometimes, the people we know the most, we kind of know their weaknesses. I don't know if it's really the case, and it's something that we can talk about it more, but it struck me how little we know and how much we actually, and, so possible answer is, okay, collect data on Israel or every country you want to say something about, which is great. I'm all for collecting data. But if we want to be not just an academic field, but as you try to do in your work, try to take the academic knowledge and translate it into practice, we can't really collect data every time, especially because sometimes I think we might have emailed about it before. I can remember now, the difference between, even within COVID, right? So like vaccination versus mask wearing, which are both kind of two very important COVID-related behaviors the government was interested in encouraging, but they're so different from each other, right? So from the perspective of, how to induce compliance, when you talk about mask wearing, you really, really need people to want to do it right. Or else people will put it, they will cover their mouth, their nose will be out, or they're not really, the monitoring is a bit limited. Definitely in the areas where it's most important, your monitoring is reduced, right? It's easier to enforce when people walk in the park, but then you don't need the mask. And you have examples from all around the world, police officer running up to someone doing jogging, I don't know, on the beach, where it doesn't really important if you have a mask, but it's just easier to enforce. But this is a bit of a different topic. And then, so let's take, mask wearing. In mask wearing, we can't really rely too much on monitoring. We have to get the public to voluntarily want to cooperate, because or else you can't really put a fine on someone not properly wearing the mask. But think on vaccination. Let's say I come into the room when the nurse is there and she or he gives the shot. It's not important if I'm smiling or not. It's not important if I enjoy. At the end of the day, it's as effective whether I'm happy, whether I believe it. Once I got you to get into the room, to some extent, it's no longer important how much you believe the vaccine is important. It's important only to get you there. So it's a completely different behavior. So we need to motivate, and research done on masks probably irrelevant on vaccine and vice versa. And you can do it on many other related behavior, which again raises the same question I started with: how complicated it is to know what is the right tool to use in a given behavior, in a given country, in a given population, with a certain level of belief in what you do. And if the answer is always collect data, we have a problem, which we need to think, okay, what do we do if we can't always collect enough data? And also, collect data is not always the solution. It's very hard to isolate causality in such behavior. Like, there are studies, but again, it takes weeks sometimes it can take months. The situation is really changing, right? So you do it in a certain date where the R of, how the spread of the disease, and then in 2 months, it's completely different, right? I don't know, let's say someone became sick. It's also a new phenomenon. Now we see that once you already became sick with COVID, you treat it less seriously, right? Because you're less afraid from it to some extent, right? And so how could you even, let's say you studied something about what will affect the public in April, it might be less relevant in July just because 3 months passed, even if it's the same behavior and the same country and the same type of population, just because something changed. So I think a very important lesson and a challenge for researchers is how to deal with that, how to come up with a way to take existing knowledge and kind of tailor it to specific situations. And I'm sure, something that people who do like, consulting like you in terms of like in industry, there's so much research out there. How do you know to take from all the knowledge out there and pinpoint and understand, okay, this is what's best to do? I mean, maybe sometimes you can do pilot or, but not always the case. And even this has its own limitation.
And it's fascinating because it's really interesting link through to the corporate world.
Mm-hmm.
Because, what you're pointing towards is not all compliance requirements are the same. The population that you're trying to influence may not be the same, and in fact may not be consistent in of itself. And so we've got this moving target where we can't easily replicate. So what's your thinking about how one goes to solve that? Because, I love this point that you make about data, because it isn't often available. And even if it were available, we might not have the time to be able to gather it. We need to react quickly to things. It might not be feasible for us to do that. And so for lots of reasons, we can't run neat experiments. And so from my perspective, it's really refreshing to have an academic turn around and say, obviously, this is what we would do if we could, but recognizing the scale of the problem, we need to do something slightly differently. So what was your thinking around that?
So my guess is that the first step is to acknowledge that. So in a sense, I think, and there is Katie Milkman. She's a psychologist from Wharton. And she does a lot of research about behavioral public policy, and she does like mega studies about vaccination and stuff like that. And some of her studies, she asks experts to predict what will work. So let's say, she tries 10 different techniques to induce people to get the vaccine. She then asks a panel of experts to predict what they think going to work more. And in some of her studies, some of them really came out recently, she finds negative correlation between what expert says and what happens. And, on one hand, it's fascinating, right? So experts this is what they do their whole life, try to predict what will work. And not only they can't predict, they even do it, less than random. Like even someone who didn't know anything would have done to some extent better. So on one hand, it's fascinating and it shows the importance of, again, as I said, collecting data. On the other hand, it's something every expert needs to know all the time. The fact that you read so much about it, not only does it not give you the, the certainty that you will know, but sometimes it's even going to harm your ability because you are thinking of all other studies that maybe were somewhat different, and it harms your ability to even be more intuitively correct about what's going to work. And what and this is this ERC grant that I got, in a sense, tries to engage in the ability to build some predictive model by really collecting data systematically across number of doctrines at the same time on the same population across few countries, and do it also over time. And we talk about in a second maybe about this importance of over time, and try to identify the variation, let's say in culture or in the characteristic of the doctrine, and see why is it the case that something worked like that in that doctrine, in that culture, and didn't work in some other, and accumulate the data to come up with a better ability to take existing knowledge and at least be able to translate or somehow transform it in a way which will be more helpful in other contexts. Because it, again, so if you just take many, many different studies, it's very hard to understand from the existing studies what's going to happen in the next dilemma we face if it's not the exact same population. But once you already take diverse population, diverse cultures, and diverse doctrines, study them at once, you are able to come up with predictive models which will help you come up with at least approximation, saying, okay, so if in Denmark, in that context, engaging in fines and mandates led to that result, if we focus on this doctrine, which is a bit different, and this culture, which on the comparative dimensions we have on cross-cultural comparison is different to that extent, this is what we expect the situation to be. So this is, in a sense, the need for this really huge data collection across many countries over time to at least to be able to start to answer such a fundamental question in everything related to compliance, right? So like what to do. We don't always have the time to collect data, and we can't do it properly. And this is one step that I hope this grant will help. A second dimension is the notion that, again, came up a lot in COVID, and this is the notion of voluntary compliance. And again, it could be for various reasons. So one reason is just we recognize we cannot monitor. So it's very hard to use extrinsic or external measures. So we try to get the public to work with us. So we'll say, okay, we can't really know when you violate the rules. So we're going to ask you, I don't know, if you go near elderly people, try to wear masks. So, trying to get your sense of solidarity or morality, try to help you understand the science around the vaccine. Was very, all kind of rumors about the science not being good enough and so on. So to convince people. And then what, again, is missing in compliance research, and I think also for the corporate world, is to understand that you can't really measure what works in a one-shot study. And again, most of the research on compliance would sometimes, okay, we do that. Let's say, think of lab experiments, right? Think of many of the incentive studies when we try to understand what incentives are best. So you present participants with a certain fine, with a certain incentive scheme, then you watch their behavior for 5 minutes and see whether they cooperated, whether they sanctioned someone, what did they do. But we all know intuitively, and especially the research tell us that things that happen in the stimuli and then 5 minutes, it tell us nothing about what will happen in the long run. And supposedly the main advantage of voluntary compliance is supposed to be this whole notion of sustainability. This whole notion of we ask you to do something and you do it without us keep, giving you now again incentives and monitoring. And again, also with COVID, I mean, I think no one thought it's going to be, we're almost 3 years now and doesn't seem to go away. So you have to somehow cause people to internalize and adapt and create this new kind of habitual and more repeated behavior. And again, this is something that most of the existing research do not do. They don't really try to capture the compliant behavior over time. So what will happen, in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month, in a year? What are the reactions of, let's say, I'm very successful in getting compliant, let's say 80% compliant. I'm very successful in getting it because I announced that fines are going to be dramatic. What will happen after a few months? Is going to be reactance by the public, adaptation, Maybe it's going to be, I don't know, so many courts are going to deal with the fines and find all kind of problems with that. Relative to other maybe approaches, it might be more sustainable over time. So again, something which was completely missing from the research, and I think COVID told us we need to do, and this is not just for COVID. Also, if you think about, everyone talks about the environment and the need to cause people to adopt behaviors. This is not a one-shot situation, right? For the actually to have an effect on people, you can't just come up with okay, now we're going to find, I don't know, someone who didn't. We have to cause people to internalize, to create habits, to believe, and we need to understand whether it's actually going to work over time. And again, this is something that this research tries to will try to uncover what approaches are more likely to work over time, to what extent. And also, this is related to something I think we talked in the past, the whole notion of quality of compliance, right? We talked about that. And maybe, the mask I started with is a good example, right? The situation in which we need not just for you to do it, but we need you to do it properly. And again, supposedly intrinsic motivation and voluntary compliance supposed to be better in that, but we actually can't know for sure, and we have to study that in a very systematic way over time to see whether it's really the case.
When you articulate in that way, it's fascinating, and you're raising some fundamental questions about how we think about compliance. It's those constants that I referred to earlier, that this is always going to be the same problem. People are always going to have the same reaction to it. And the read across between, that takes us from a very sort of static, presumptive world into one where people's minds change and situations change. So that time element seems to me to be absolutely critical. And we're moving from, if you like, perfect laboratory conditions into the real world, which is challenging and difficult. So obviously lots of data out there. I'm intrigued as to how do you sort of even start to get your hands around this? I mean, you can point to the issues, but what's the approach going to be to collating these things and thinking about some of the sort of softer dynamics that maybe we don't always have the data points for?
Right. So, you're right. And it's sometimes you get this reaction on many projects that you ask really good questions, but I didn't like the answer so much. It's sometimes happen in research that it's easier to show what's wrong in existing research. It's not that easy to do better, but we have to try, I think, to do it all the time. So I think from my perspective, one thing to start with and kind of identify the dynamic is to understand that a lot of the research we have actually don't really talk to each other. So, we talk now about compliance, but, think about how much research, and, this is related to maybe the previous book, was done about honesty. And there is some correlation between compliance and honesty, but they're not the same field. And, there is a lot of research about like honesty across time. Think about another related literature about cooperation. Okay, this is completely different literature than compliance or honesty, but also try to understand when we can cause people to be cooperative, even in situation when they might be able to free ride or when functioning is not optimal. And we have fourth literature about regulation and self-regulation. Okay, so people, it's mostly like political scientists, focus on the whole kind of situation where command and control regulation and more traditional approaches are seen as inappropriate when we keep trying to come up with self-regulation techniques where we give more responsibility for the corporation or the entity who want to cooperate, and they also document it. And again, some of the things that I want to do is to say, okay, there's so many studies that all focus on this problem of changing behavior over time, but they don't speak to each other because it's people coming from different disciplines. So you have psychologists, legal scholars, political scientists, working on in these areas, rarely speaking to each other, but they could actually help each other. And really the first kind of studies we already start to do now is systematic reviews and meta-analysis to try and combine the studies we already have and see what is the relative contribution of each field. So if, honesty will tell us a lot about situations where what we do is really going to diminish very fast because of ambiguity or because of lack of identified victim. And cooperation will tell us something about how we perceive others in the group. And this will predict whether people keep doing it or not. And if you just be able to combine insight from those literature and think in an integrative way about what is it that we expect people to do and how, I think this will be, I hope it will be an important step in trying to answer that. But I think in the end, your intuition is right that, the questions are hard and I have, this, how to collect data systematically and how to combine the reviews. At the end, we might still be left with open questions. And I think it's a huge challenge. And to some extent, it's even broader than just compliance. And I think this is a general problem with the whole applied social science where researcher can flourish and do fantastic studies, but when people try to take the knowledge to solve real problems, I think we didn't recognize enough how hard it is and how many inaccuracies might happen in the process. And at least I think, and I think my mission and mission of others is try to improve the data and make it more integrative and help people understand at least what's different when you look on some different situation, or, maybe a different approach to that might be, to what extent do you really need all the dimensions to know about? So let me give you an example. Let's say, another dimension which is somewhat missing in existing literature, usually we focused on changing effect. So you have like a control condition with no intervention, then you do some intervention, and you see that you increase compliance by 6%, which is great. You could even replicate it. Everything is great. Now, sometimes the more important question is not so much if you change and to what extent, but the proportion of people who are going to change their behaviors, because in different situations, you are interested in different proportions. So just an example with like 3 areas that I worked on in the past to just help us realize not just what is the knowledge, of maybe in some context, we don't need as much knowledge to operate. So think about the importance of getting 100% cooperation across different fields. And let's say the field of trade secret, environmental behavior, and whistleblowing. It's just 3 typical examples. In whistleblowing, we only need to mobilize the behavior of very few people, right? So we have an organization, something is wrong happening, and we think, okay, how are we going to intervene and cause at least some people in this organization to raise a red flag or to blow the whistle, or at least go talk to the compliance officer to say, okay, something is wrong. So this is an area when we think about the existing knowledge and we try to implement it, we say, okay, this is now in our dilemma, we only need maybe one person is enough. So this will really affect how certain we need to be in what really works and to what extent, because we need, in terms of proportion-wise, we don't need as much. So maybe, intrinsic motivation might be appropriate here because we don't need to know everything about everyone in the workplace. We only need few. The opposite is trade secret, right? The whole kind of, intellectual property, which is protected by secrecy and done reasonable means to protect it. And then we need 100% cooperation, because even if one person goes out and, the Coca-Cola is the favorite example, goes out and tells the secret loses its economic value. So if I'm facing now a situation where I need the cooperation of everyone in the workplace for that to work, then I'm asking myself when I'm looking at the knowledge, okay, now I know what dilemma I'm facing. I need, admin. But there is this very common example, which is somewhere in the middle, which like environmental, and also like the vaccine. This is a bit different, but let me start with the environment, where we have what could be called, the more the merrier, right? So if let's say we only have, 20% recycling, it's really bad, but it still doesn't mean that these 20% are not helpful at all. I mean, it just, in a slower pace, help us protect the planet. Vaccine is a bit different, right? No one talks about 100%, but let's say we started for 50%, with the Omicron, and then some of the variants we recognize we need higher. But if we only need 70%, might mean that we don't need to really pull all the big guns, because we need really a smaller proportion. So this is just kind of an example for something which help us if we think hard enough about the situation we're facing and we ask ourselves, okay, for how long we need the cooperation, how many people we need to cooperate, how much we care about the quality of the cooperation, what are the likelihood that external circumstances might change, what are the likelihood of, as we talked before, static versus dynamic situation, how easy it is for us to monitor changes. So is it very hard, very easy? And basically, once we answer ourselves a set of questions, we can come up with a much more refined question. We go back to the researchers and ask them, okay, this is what I need in my organization or in the workplace or, in the government, in the state level, country level dilemma. Help me figure this out. But now at least we know exactly what we need. And we can come up and basically understand, okay, there is no one answer. The whole kind of cliche, no one policy fits. So it's a cliche, but it's true. But at least we know we know what are the dimensions we care about. We care about resiliency, about willingness to pay, about sustainability. There are many different dimensions. Sometimes we don't care as much. Vaccination. You just to go in, you get the shot that sometimes we do need it. And at least when you understand the behavioral dimension and understand the variation, at least you know what to look for, what is the answers you're looking for. Again, probably you're not going to get it's not so much the best answer, but it's not enough information to give very accurate answer, but I think it would be much better than just say, yeah, incentives always work. Or, use nudges, right? Again, something everyone says, okay, you should just use nudges. And I've seen it, right? They always say, okay, can you give us some nudge so that people will wear masks? And as if, because again, it might be even some omnipotent nature of this field where people thought a kind of magician, right? They can come up with, you just do this nudge and not recognizing what you lose from, let's say nudge it when people don't learn to understand why they do it. You just kind of, okay, you create your awareness, but there is adaptation. So, one time, 3 times it worked, but then people get used to the nudge and then it stops working. And we need to understand what is it that you want. You want people to do something once, or you want them to adopt the habit and do it constantly over time.
It struck me that, from a government perspective, and I guess this also applies to corporates as well, it's not as if you're doing one thing and one thing only. So if you can deal with COVID, but I'm in Germany at the moment, and I was struck. There's obviously an attempt by the government to reduce the reliance on Russian gas, and so that's another campaign that the government is trying to launch to get people to be more energy efficient. Plays into climate change, but also that piece. And then once I thinking about that, I thought, well, that's another challenge they've got to manage alongside the COVID challenge, which remains. And there's probably a load of other things that the government are going to be healthier, for example. And so there's a ton of these things that it's not as if this is a one-off exercise. And it always strikes me that when we look at compliance subjects, we often look at it in isolation and say, well, here's a thing we need to achieve. But of course, in achieving that, you will impact some of your other things. There could be too much patronizing stuff coming from the government. So what I think is really interesting about your work is, yes, it's opening a box and saying, this is way more complicated than but it goes even beyond that. And so I love this idea of, look, there isn't a simple solution. To your point, there isn't that one nudge. And even if there was, it wouldn't necessarily be effective forever. But there's this idea that you're going to have to do some other things. Maybe something else will come around the corner that's also going to require, that sits alongside this. And so we have to start thinking not about single perfect solutions, but actually about the broader challenge.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think you might have discussed this I remember reading something of yours on LinkedIn about the whole notion of, responsive regulation. So it's Braithwaite and Iris. They have this famous book that really affected compliance. And I think it should be developed more. The whole notion, and it's exactly a point you're making. So, it could be responsive, could be on many angles. It could be sequential. And I think that, so basically, you start with a certain level of tools, which are kind of might affect some people. And then you keep using a harsher meat, right? This is their original. It could be, for example, used maybe with big data. And there is now a new concept in legal theory about personalization, which in many ways you could think that in the corporate world, it might be even easier than in government level, because corporations have more knowledge about their employees than government have about the citizen, right? Because, privacy, and because it's a much larger, more sensitive, right? I mean, there are factors you don't want to take into account, even if they explain variation in behavior. Corporations, for example, know a lot about the people, especially with big data and personalization of the intervention. You can actually tailor-make the intervention, not just to the situation, but also to the kind of even subpopulation. So it's managers, so people in that branch, or and basically kind of say, okay, we use that, it didn't work. Now we're going to test that. And again, because of all the complexity we mentioned, and we know that there is no solution for everyone, we actually going to come up with, a whole kind of area of tools, starting with sanctions and incentives, and moving to various nudges and reminders, and giving people the reasoning and morality and solidarity. And, it depends on the social components. You have really a whole array of tools that you can use, and you can tailor-make it based on past behavior of people. And because let's say you start some compliance program in the organization, you know already whether it worked or not worked, and what people and what behaviors, and you keep updating. And it could be the case. And again, I think there should be consideration for, you don't want to discriminate, you don't want to harm people's sense of, how come I'm getting this intervention when the guy in the I mean, there are problems with this approach, but, there is the new book that came by Ben Shahar and Farak in Oxford Press. It's called Personalization and the Law, and they come from a tort perspective and focus on how kind of different laws could be applied to different people based on the past behavior. But I think it could be taken into compliance as well. So, and again, I think that on a factory level, or, whatever, on a much kind of lower unit, so much about the people you try to change it, in a sense, not to use that information about their past behavior with regard to previous compliance programs and previous interventions, and not use it to improve. And I think it could be even justified in terms of equality. So the notion of, treating different people differently, again, you need to be very sensitive, because it could be very easily go in the wrong direction. And, sometimes you can even, I can think of, maybe people recognize, if you use this intervention with me, you're already labeled as a troublemaker. And I can see why that in itself might create some self-fulfilling prophecy. So it needs to be very gentle. Maybe ideally not, focus on the individual level, but some interaction between, what's your type of work occupation and a specific behavior, but use that all the time and keep learning and keep updating, especially because we know that each intervention has its pros and cons, and we need to be very smart in the way we apply it. And we're really seeing that employers and organizations enjoy liberties that government do not. Just because even the collection of data, I also in touch with like tax authorities, and, they also have a lot of information, but they're very wary about what can be used or not used, because, you don't want to get people think, oh, if I do that, now I'm going to be audited because, the algorithm recognize something. But I think the future is going there. And we can also, talk about the interaction between behavioral, public policy, compliance, and algorithmic management. I mean, I think the two, at the end, will come up with some interesting combination and solution, because, the behavioral approach really said, oh, it's not that one tool. You have maybe now 30 tools that you can employ. and people are more complex, situations are more complex. We have interaction, we have culture, we have that, we have that. And so to combine all that by humans become very complex. But algorithms, especially given, learning and adapting, okay, we use that on deaf people and it worked. Now we keep updating and kind of trying to improve what we do. And again, I think you have to have very strong ethics on board, right? To prevent exploitation, prevent situation where you end up using the knowledge about decision making to cause people to behave in a certain way. And maybe now that I mentioned ethics, I think it's also important to raise awareness to, is it really the case that we always want people to, be intrinsically motivated, right? So the whole like voluntary compliance, and, this is something I touch more in the book of can the public be trusted? Do we want to live in a society where the public can be trusted, right? So intuitively we say, of course, right? It feels very, democratic and, where you trust people, right? You don't just frighten, you don't scare them. You actually trust them because you see them as people who are responsible and you give them autonomy. And there are studies that, if you trust people, they become more trustworthy and there is reciprocity. So, it's great. And I think, we talked in the past, I think about the whole pledges research that I work with my colleague Al where we try to replace fines with pledges and commitments and behavioral mechanisms which are supposed to enhance trust. But there's also a lot to worry about because someone might say, for example, actually, the fact that the government wants me to be happy when I pay my taxes is very problematic. Maybe the best they can ask for is to me to pay my taxes. The notion that they want also to make me happy about it, the whole behavioral field is always trying to make sure it doesn't cross the line with, brainwashing, right? You don't want the government to start to manipulate you into thinking taxes are great, just pay more of them. I mean, you do want, and I think even from a democratic perspective, it's important that citizens will be suspicious to some extent. That citizens will think, well, why do the government want me to do that? Does it make sense? I mean, the whole notion that we always kind of, and I think a lot of people in my kind of role as COVID started, we were all very committed to cause the public to know that what the government says is true. Right? And I still believe that at the end of the day, democratic governments want to do good for people. But again, part of democracy is also to make sure the public could criticize, right? So the whole, the whole nudges, things that goes beyond the radar where without your full awareness, causing you to say, oh, wearing mask is so great. And I feel, I for one thing that, wearing mask is not really interfering with your autonomy. Right? Okay, you wear a mask. Maybe I want to help you feel good about it and feel responsible and stuff. But this could be a slippery slope, right? I mean, if you develop those tools and help government refine their regulatory tools and know a lot about how different people think and what makes them tick, this could be problematic, right? And we need to be wary of that. Some people will mention that in China, for example, you have a lot of, level of trust are very high. And the surveys are almost as good as Scandinavian countries, which are usually kind of, and so, and there is a lot of research and discussion, both theoretical and empirical, about the whole, social credit initiative they have there, where in a sense, they also focus on this notion of how to improve people and have them internalize. So all those things need to be keep in mind, and I think it's important that in every effort, both in government level and in organization or corporate level, we keep reminding ourselves that just making people more compliant is not the only thing to care about. We always need to think of what we gain and what we lose by that, and even maybe creating a mandatory role for someone who doesn't have interest in the success of the compliance program, to make sure we're not too much, getting into, we're going to use that and everyone is gonna, you know, do things. So again, you need to think about, okay, is it only things we're certain, like safety, right? Very few people could object that safety is important, but I don't know, maybe, safety could have other interests or, I mean, again, you need to have someone ask the questions to make sure once you start to use those tools, and especially with the help of algorithms that really uncover patterns no one noticed before, to make sure you're balanced and you are mindful of what you do with this knowledge.
That fascinates me. And I read something yesterday I thought was really intriguing where somebody was saying, it was actually Ian Leslie, who's been a previous guest on the show. And he was talking about diversity and inclusion. And he said, if you really wanted to create a diversity and inclusion function that's effective, you ought to have people in that team who don't believe in it, who actually oppose it and act as almost devil's advocates within the function. And I think that's a really interesting point you're making, because there is a tendency when one thinks about compliance to sort of hide behind the virtuousness of it. Well, obviously we want to be seen to be complying with the rules and therefore we have the right to do these things. And therefore we're not challenging ourselves. And I think your point around the slippery slope is very powerful there, because it would be really, really easy to justify terrible things, or even not so terrible things, but things that point in a direction very, very easily, because you'd use well, we have to do this, or the regulation requires it, or it's the right outcome. And I think that's really interesting in a world where we want innovation, where actually, to put it simply, we occasionally need people to break the rules. There are some rules you don't want people to break under any circumstances, but back to your point, there are certain we can live with people break, because actually that's how we get progress.
Right. It's actually very interesting because I've also been on a panel where, Israel has this whole notion of startup nation. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, where, I think probably the highest rate of startups and a lot of people, and innovation and ethicality are somewhat in conflict. And it's true, right? So what always seen, at least in Israeli, in discussion about, policy, about the self-perception of Israelis that we're not very good in following rules. And people are very kind of want to make up their own mind about everything. And this is somewhat positively correlated with innovation and creativity. And I think it's a balance that every country or every organization needs to strike. Okay, what is it that you prefer the most, and what approach should you favor? And especially because sometimes you can achieve one goal, but at the same time harm other goals. So there is a study I did with Francesca Gino and Mariam Kochaki about, I think you might know it, about ethical codes and how different languages affect employees. And the kind of famous result of that study is that if you use more formal language, it's going to improve ethicality, but the informal language and the more family, like we and so on, reduce ethicality. The less famous result of that study, that in terms of where you're happier, it was the exact opposite. So people prefer to be in an organization where the culture was more kind of, family oriented, but they were also more likely to cheat. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, what do I want from my employees when I'm deciding? And this is, one tiny example, but even when I'm designing the code, what's most important for me? That my employees will be happy and, they will come to work happy, or that they will be ethical. And again, as you said, I mean, we kind of say, of course, ethics, this is what we care about. But no, maybe, especially because it's not 0 or 100, right? It just, have high effect low. It's not, maybe in the long run, right? We did, even though that particular study actually did have some overtime results, but still, was a month. Maybe in the long run, it's actually more important that people will be happy. And also with, going back to the COVID example, I think we know now things none of us thought about, how, all kind of mental illness triggered like anxiety and stuff just by whole closures and keeping people at homes, right? So it was great for preventing the spread of the virus, no one at the time almost talked about, okay, what's going to a teenager do if they don't go to school for a year? What's going to be the effect on their well-being? Did someone even kind of put it in the things we calculated when we adopted those policy? What's going to be the effect of, the whole vaccination campaign? And I'm not sure about the UK also adopted the green passport. I think they did, right? Where you can get to certain places, and, certain countries, even liberal ones, were very aggressive in trying. What's going to be the long run effect of that and other vaccinations? Maybe, I don't know, now some, reactance might happen where more people now are going to be more suspicious because, they use so much force. They probably did it for a reason. And they might, people who might have, take their kids to regular vaccine program now become more wary when you actually reduce this, very harsh needs, right? So just also example to recognize first how little we know at the time. B, as time goes by, we learn more and more things we never thought about it when we started. So it's again some, I think, thought process we need to be mindful where we think of what's the right thing to do. That maybe we will know more, and also be ready to update the recommendations we make as we move along, because reality change and we recognize new things we didn't think about before. I mean, personally, I still think the vaccination effort was, justified, but, it could have been different, right? And at least I'm certain no one thought about long-term effect. And that is, we tend not to think about long-term effect in general. And it's, especially problematic when it comes to behavioral intervention.
And the thing that strikes me is that a little bit like the vaccine, we have side effects to vaccines. The same principle applies to all of these behavioral interventions in that they're not, back to your point, it's not it's not a simple binary. If you do this, this will happen. It impacts people differently. And it's almost a case of there will be unintended consequences. So we should recognize that up front, not make this blind presumption that we've now sorted this out. And that'll change over time. So I'm really struck by your implicitly sort of saying, well, we just need to, it's almost like we need to be honest about the fact it's not going to work 100%. We need to think about the fact that there are going to be things that we didn't plan for. And so this becomes much more of an ongoing exercise. I tend to see a lot of people thinking that once we do the code of conduct, we've nailed it. Let's move on to the next, and we just refresh it occasionally without realizing that, like any other sorts of decisions, there are trade-offs to be made.
Yeah, definitely. And again, if you look carefully across many, many studies around compliance, you will, I think, I would say most of the things I can recall right now, the answer will be, well, we have a mixed effect. And sometimes the mixed effect is exactly because, some studies take into account this factor, some take in that factor. Very, very, very few things have very clear answer that, this is the best choice. It will always, and really even things like sanctions. That, for years we thought, even for that, there is some consensus that emerged with some things about sanctions, but again, there are also many other things that we didn't think about in the effect of, let's think about crowding out, right? Relatively, it's not that new, but it's relatively new. And when it's crowding out, the whole notion that sanction might undermine, when is it going to happen? When it's not? When the overall, sanction is better or not? Again, I think results are mixed usually, and also the best way to find what to do is to think specifically about the situation and think to yourself, okay, so there might be crowding out, but do I care? Maybe I don't care. Or how easy it is to implement other methods, and try to using by thinking about the situation and recognizing how limited is the information, and try and pick and choose and tailor kind of the right mixture, recognizing what are the things we know with what more certainty, and what are the things that even if we don't know enough about, maybe we can live with the uncertainty because the result of not knowing is not that dramatic. And again, I think it's going to vary by situation. And also when I speak with policymakers, I always say I respect and there's a lot of research about how risk averse regulators are. They have something that works. And they say, let's keep that, right? I mean, they're very conservative by nature. They're kind of afraid of innovation because, and again, it's some sort of a bias, right? Supposedly, no one will punish them for keep doing what their predecessor did. And if they adopt something new, they might gain some credit, but they can lose a lot. And so it caused them to really prefer and there is some research about why there's so little innovation in the public sector. People from my field, we come up with new, this is going to work. This is so much better. And they kind of, and it took me a while, as I even, grew a bit older, having more white, more gray in my hair, to recognize they have a point. I mean, I respect that more now than I did 10 years ago. This fear not to be mistaken. Some of it is kind of an agency problem where this is not good, right? They should be rewarded for innovation as much as they're going to be, especially if they did the reasonable thing, consider the science, recognize the percentage, did something, didn't work, it backfired. You need to be able to allow them to make mistakes. But because of all the limitations of behavioral science, policymaker, I mean, not to mention the whole replication crisis, and I mean, there are other things, I have more respect now for this kind of some risk aversion approach of policymakers, and say, maybe we should do better before we convince you to change what you do. I mean, maybe it's our problem because, especially if and I'm trying to be very honest about what we know, we don't know, and then you kind of see, okay, maybe let's keep what we're doing, and I really can respect that approach more now.
And there's something really interesting about the behavioral challenge that you've got there, right? Because we don't just need to think about what they need to think about in terms of influencing the behavior of the organizations they're regulating, and then ditto the same problem for compliance within those organizations. There's a question for us trying to influence them and saying we have to also think behaviorally when it comes to telling the story. Because if you just come along and say, you're doing it all wrong, here's a better way of doing things, one, that wouldn't be entirely true. But secondly, it's not thinking about them as human beings in terms of how they react to a message. So I've sort of, there's almost a sort of meta problem that goes all the way through this.
And the sad thing is that, and there are research, about politicians and stuff, that if you talk with confidence, people buy that even if you're completely wrong. And I think scientists who have, too much confidence, especially in this field, I don't know. I'm not sure how you can be that confident. And that's the problem, right? I mean, the more careful you are, you're less, and in a sense, they should listen to you more if you're careful, but they listen to you less. Because sometimes in my field, we joke a lot about economy, right? How, on one hand, you got the reality completely wrong. But something in this socialization of economy make them be very self-assured. They really always said when they talk, you feel they know what they're doing, and the reality is more simple for economists. And every time you are in a situation where you need to, fight, not fight, but you need to maybe show the opposite view of an economist, you're always going to lose because they come up with a very strong self-righteousness about the field, and I have a lot of respect for economics, and I think the whole translation of reality into math is super, super important, and the contributions to social science, I'm not trying to mock them, but I think the notion of confidence, and whether you are kind of a behavioral public policy scientist, it's like, well, it depends on this interaction, people are bad, situations are bad, this effect going to work in 20%. At the end of the day, people say, well, you ask good questions, right? As we started, but they don't feel you give them, okay, this is what you need to do. I have the confidence. I have a scientist who told me. And that, I don't know, something to think about the disciplines. I mean, maybe we should be more self-assured. I don't know. It's a good question.
And final question for me is I'm fascinated by how all of this has affected your personal perspective on compliance. I suspect you're a little bit like me in the sense that you can't switch off from this stuff, right? It's constant, and because we're all subject to rules, and in many cases imposing rules in our own universes. But how's your personal reflection on compliance evolved as you've experienced all these sort of thought processes and experiences?
Well, I think on one hand, my kids sometimes complain about that because this is, again, related to everything. So every time I tell them something, I think, well, this is a good research question. I was telling my daughter the other day to go on the bus, and we have like KN95, the better mask, and then the simpler one. And then I thought, you're better off with the cane, but then you might take it off because it's harder. So I think, this is a very interesting compliance dilemma. I mean, should we ask people for really to do the best thing, but then we might lose some of them along the way because the KN95 is harder to breathe with, or we should aim to get below average compliance, wearing the simple mask, but then more people. And she said, okay, what to wear? What's the research like? The whole notion that every time you say, this is a research question, it's nice because it's very interesting. But sometimes I recognize when she was trying to think, okay, what mask to take became, public transportation where you need the kind of, you not always need to be a scientist. You need to, first be a parent, only then. But, this is like half a joke, but in a sense, I think it's true. I mean, you see it everywhere. I have, this grant about voluntary compliance. And then yesterday I went to the synagogue. And now the situation now in Israel is that they strongly ask you to wear mask. It's not a mandate. They just strongly ask you. And I was there, maybe me and two other person out of, 500 were with mask. And I remember telling myself, okay, so what's the deal, right? So I really want the government to be able not to order you, but to ask you and explain why it's important. But it doesn't seem to work. So should I make any conclusion from it or not? So, sometimes just this perspective makes me, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but, I'm kind of asking myself, why so few people, they really keep asking this broadcasting over the radio. We really ask you to wear a mask. You're not going to be fined. We're not going to punish you, but it's really important to protect the elderly and all the things we have written about. Then we just, solidarity and morality. And somehow at the end of the day, this is, I think, I didn't check all around rooms and indoor situation in Israel, but the feeling is that it's close to zero cooperation. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if it's a reaction to, again, because it was so harsh before. Once you stop being harsh, you can't shift to, just playing nice, right? You need to, and this, this is also maybe an important lesson for long-term effect, that if you start in a very aggressive way and then you abandon it, you're going to kind of lose people's ability to cooperate with you once you only ask them nice. It's really important that you do it. But yeah, so I keep definitely, I walk around and I see it all the time. It's interesting, but sometimes could be somewhat upsetting because, for the most part, you don't see it. Yeah.
I didn't have visions of you walking around sort of saying to people, I wouldn't do it that way. You should try this technique. I wasn't quite going that far, but I do think it is fascinating as a sort of, one has to recognize it's an anecdote based on your experience in that unique situation. And of course, it struck me that with the mask wearing, you're sort of contributing to the dynamic because either you're wearing one and therefore setting a particular norm, at least in what you're doing, or you're not wearing one. So you're almost participating in the compliance environment as well. So if you start to think about it too hard, it gets to a stage where it's not just you looking at what they're doing. It's also, you're a contributing factor. So you've got a pair of lenses that the average person doesn't have.
Right.
And if you're not too careful, that can be quite stressful.
Right. And it's also interesting. Am I have a higher obligation to wear a mask just because I study there? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not. Like, why should I stand with 3 hours with the mask and everyone else can enjoy the free air? Like, it's also a question about the interaction between science and reality.
Love it. Before I let you go, Yuval, and once again, thank you so much. It's been so thought provoking. I'm going to listen to the episode back again as I always do, and I'll have a million more thoughts. But remind people firstly about your first book and then secondly, the book that you've got coming out.
Oh, okay. So the first one came in 2018. It's called The Law of Good People, and tried to introduce the notion of behavioral ethics and the fact that people do a lot of their bad behaviors unintentionally, and then how the law should adapt itself to situations where a lot of the misconduct that happens is driven by forces which are not related to people wanting or intending to do it, and trying to demonstrate that in the context like discrimination, and so to show how behavioral ethics could help us create better regulatory tools to deal with unintentional unethicality or ordinary unethicality. The new book, also coming from Cambridge Press, it's called Can the Public Be Trusted? Again, it's inspired by COVID and some of the ideas we talked about, to try to take it also to commercial ethics and environment and taxation, and basically try to examine in what situations can we achieve voluntary compliance, whether it's how good it's going to work, what are we going to lose or pay, and is it desirable normative? And again, accounting for things like technological monitoring and things we know about literature of trust and cooperation, and try to create some roadmaps for whether it's something we could somehow achieve in a more context, that we are not just, forcing people to behave in such a way, or even just incentivizing them, but actually creating the right intrinsic motivation to comply, which might be good enough if we gain the advantage of that associated with voluntary compliance.
And it goes without saying, and if people haven't listened to the very first episode of this show, which featured you, Yuval, talking around the law of good people, highly recommended. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Law of Good People continues to be a book that I go back to. And as I was saying to you before we started recording, I referred to it without even realizing it. And then I'm halfway through an explanation. I suddenly think I must give you credit for getting me there in the first place. So it's hugely ingrained into the work that I do. In the best possible way, a real gateway drug into this space. So comes highly, highly recommended. I've absolutely no doubt the new book will be the same. And as people will be able to tell, I think you engage with this in a really thoughtful, practical way. And I love the fact that you're moving into a space that says, look, we can do the research in the lab and that's great, we can get the data, but how do we do this in the real world? And recognizing that this is much, much more complex than we might like to admit. So for all of those reasons, one of my absolute favorite academics. So it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. You have an open invitation anytime you want to come back. But thank you so much for all of that, Yuval.
Thank you, for the kind words and for the great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Yuval for his return visit to the show, and to you for listening. To find out more about Yuval, his research, his book, The Law of Good People, and other links to things that we discussed on the show, have a look in the show notes. You'll also find a link to the first time he appeared on the show. It's not too difficult to find since it's the first episode, but nonetheless, I like to make things easy for you. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients, helping them to manage their human risk and bringing behavioural science to ethics and compliance, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with a special double header for the 199th and 200th episodes of the show, so look out for that. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.